By the time the sun rose over the glass and steel of his last address, Alfred Moreau could no longer remember how many towers his name crowned. There were banks with his stamp in 3 continents, shipping lines that had once spelled his vanity in hull paint, residential neighborhoods named for him, and a private island near the equator where he had buried, in volcanic earth, the secrets that had paid for his first office. 60 years of appetite, calculation, and the slow, clean amputation of sentiment had built an empire so dense that even his accountants admitted they had stopped being surprised at the bottom line. He had been, in his life, an exceptional man and an ordinary machine, decisive where others hesitated, relentless where others softened. He had loved the thrill of a risk almost as much as the control that followed a win. But the body is a ledger no chart can balance forever. The doctors had told him he had 6 months to live. They had told him how the cells in his chest shrank his breaths and told him how the veins would tangle and call it progression. They were efficient with pity. His chair, especially designed thrown on wheels, had become his dayroom, his office, and finally, his confession. In the house they called the penthouse, which really meant the highest privilege of his life, the layers of those who shared his last months were thin and obvious. Angelo, his wife, fair and practiced in the ways of the polished, navigated corridors like a queen on appointed court days. Perfect hair, a wardrobe that told the world she still mattered, but with eyes that skimmed his chair the way the world skimmed a ledger they didn't intend to audit. At 55 she remained a woman who understood what to display and what to hide. She did not hide the truth. She and their daughters were waiting. Emma, Chloe, and Eva, his daughters, were 3 polished instruments in a set designed to hold social currency. They were beautiful in the modern way, well-tended, elaborately networked, and practiced in the art of being desirable to other people. They wore his name and used it for access. They smelled faintly of ambitions that belonged to someone else. Their moods were calibrated by the question of inheritance. When they spoke of Alfred, it was as one speaks of a failing stock. Disappointment, strategy, impatience. It did not occur to them to be with him. That left the house under the care of other hands. For over 20 years, Jessica had been that hand. Jessica's compact frame and vow of constancy had outlasted fashions and promotions. She knew how Alfred took his tea, where he liked the morning light to fall, and exactly which stories of his past would loosen the sternness from his jaw. On her worst days she still moved with the steadiness of someone who had been allowed, by a life of work, to care for another entire being. When Jessica fell ill she did not take her leave lightly. She sat him down in his chair, his room smelling of tobacco and old ink, and explained in small measured sentences that treatment would take time. She pressed a stained photograph into his hand, a younger woman, dark-haired, with Jessica's confident eyes. "My daughter, sir. Her name is Spice. She's a good girl. She can take my place for a month. Only a month." She squeezed his hand, the old dependable creature who had provided more love than his relatives had offered in his last winter. Alfred liked the photograph immediately, partly because Jessica had given it with the old cunning of people who know how to make their case. But he also liked the spark in the girl's face. There was an honesty in her look that had no time for titles. Angelo accepted Spice into the house with a nod of skepticism and convenience. If it meant Jessica could go for treatment and return, Angelo could keep her distance. She had never liked being forced to be tender. Spice arrived with the modest baggage of someone who had not yet learned that life could be bought. She moved through the house the way light does through rooms that have been empty too long, with careful discovery, with the steadiness of someone who knows how to work until the seams of a day are perfect. She was 22, careful, and luminous without meaning to be. She scrubbed the bathroom, lifted plates with practiced hands, changed bed linens, and when she fed Alfred she did it with a small, private deference that made the old man notice. It did not take long for Alfred to measure her not by the world's currency but by something simpler: attentiveness, humor, a laugh that did not compute to a calculation. They began to speak in stolen intervals, on the balcony while the city hummed below, by the window as night stitched stars into the black, during the long hours when he could no longer walk from room to room and the chair became both sanctuary and prison. She told him about the small difficulties of her childhood in a town grown poor and stubborn, about the way her mother had taught her to be useful and proud. He told her, in return, stories of risk and errors and the human cost of his pursuit of power. He spoke of ships and markets, of times he had been sold on optimism and times he had bought his own safety with a cleverness that had ruined someone else's life. She listened with a sort of joyful severity, laughing at what he called hubris and scolding him tenderly when he began to tell the same old anecdote too fluently. To the daughters, the closeness was a thing to be watched and worried at. It became a rumor sharpened by suspicion and made sharper still by fear. Rumors in that house moved fast. Emma saw the way Alfred's face softened in Spice's presence and felt her stomach tighten like a fist. Emma told Angelo. Angelo summoned Spice to the marble-floored sitting room, surrounded by the daughters whose expressions were carved from early practice in accusation. Accusations came fast and titled, "What do you want with my husband? Did your mother send you to snatch him away? Homebreaker." Spice did not have the diplomatic armor of people who grow up in high salons. She sat in the room with an evenness that made their voices sound like the shrill of an instrument badly tuned. She denied their insinuations. She was there at Jessica's request. She had no interest in stealing, and she had brought only the small, blunt tool of a working girl's integrity. Yet the look in Angelo's eyes said that integrity would count for nothing if it stood in the way of a document that signed a name and transferred billions. The next week the household decided, as households like theirs decide things, to make Spice's life a series of petty tasks, a campaign of irritation. Chloe took to making Spice fetch a glass of water from a counter 20 feet away and then sent her back to refill it without a sip. Eva instructed Spice in the humiliating choreography of adjusting a hand mirror, then refused to thank her. Small cruelties mount like water until they are a tide. Alfred watched the distance grow and felt it like a toothache behind every smile. He sent for Spice and asked her why she had pulled back. She told him the truth. The interrogation, the coldness of the family, the suspicion. He listened, his thumb absent-mindedly rubbing the crease at the corner of his photograph. Then he thought of the ledger that life had become and how, after the columns were closed, there would be no one to carry on who loved the work the way he had loved it. He thought of men who would inherit titles and properties and sell them for quick capital, for villas that gutted a legacy to make way for a party. He thought, sometimes at night, of how empty the trophies had become. They had become artifacts he had won in loneliness. At first it was a practical thought. Then it became a restless, private ache. There was no male child of his blood to carry the name and sit at the large table in the family boardroom and say no. He had not raised a son. He had raised 3 daughters who had married tastefully and multiplied their networks instead. If there was to be a continuity, not just of name but of temperament, of a stubborn willingness to keep building, he had to look outside his blood. Senator Mark, who had been his friend since a different level of power, had been persistent in his counsel. Mark had the pastoral certainty of men who spent their lives reselling another man's confidence as advice. "Alf," he said once, leaning over a dark wood table as if every bottle of wine demanded a confession, "you can craft a family that will honor what you made. You don't have to let vultures come in with their teeth already bared." When Mark's eyes had fallen on Spice as she carried stacks of napkins across the dining room, there had been that private movement an honest man will make when he sees a well-cut opportunity. "If you show her kindness," Mark said, "she will be loyal. There are fewer people left who will stay for reasons other than money." Mark's certainty was not a comfort but an encouragement. He suggested possibilities and then withdrew his hand as if to see if Alfred would press. The idea, at first unspoken, hardened inside of Alfred like something that had always been waiting. There were reasons to recoil. The obvious gap in years, the employment relationship, the asset of power that could make choice ambiguous. There were reasons to fear scandal, to fear the committee of relatives that would arrive with pens sharpened for signatures. But the thought of being able to leave the world with a descendant who shared his curiosity for consequence had a weight that tipped him. He invited Spice to sit in the small sunroom one Sunday in which the house lay strangely empty. Church had taken Angelo and the daughters away, and the city hummed like an engine in low gear beyond the windows. The sun painted slow rectangles on the Persian rug, and he felt thinner than a man with such holdings should feel. "Spice," he began, and she turned toward him with the unguarded look of someone waiting to be given instruction. He had never been so small a man when he had been the architect of so much. Now each sentence carried an explanation and also an appeal. "I have a short time to live. The doctors have told me so." Her hand moved instinctively toward his, a small human response, and he let her take it. "There is a thing I will ask of you that may shock you. It may be unfair. But I will speak plainly because there is no point in anything else." Spice's eyes widened, not in scandal but in the precise way of someone who prepares to be useful. "Sir," she said. If you could grant me one thing, he said, his voice a papered thing that had been forced into clarity by habit. If you could bear me a son. The words left a small silence between them, an imploded space where the world had to decide whether to be kind or ruthless. If you will let me love you as I have never been loved in my life, and if you would consider bearing a child for me, not because I command it but because you might choose it, I will ensure you, your mother and your family will never regret it for the rest of your lives. Spice froze. For a moment she was a sculpture of reaction, surprise, dignity, instinctive suspicion. The proposition contained a transaction disguised as intimacy and the thing she had been taught to fear most: a wealthy man asking for a private surrender. She had been raised to understand that a woman like her, in the service of a house like this, could be invisible for reasons that were both blessed and dangerous. "Sir," she said at last, with the slow firmness of someone balancing a fragile thing in her hands, "I did not come to be a bargain. My mother is ill. She asked me to cover her work. I am here to help." "I know that," he interrupted. "That's why I am asking. You will promise to—" She stopped herself because the promise he could give, wealth, status, a home, was something that had not always been kind. She knew about promises to women before. They had the tendency to fold into new obligations, to metastasize into expectations. Alfred's eyes were honest in a way that surprised her. "I have nothing to offer you that you cannot refuse. I will not force you. I will not bribe you. But I will make you an offer. A life in which your mother is healthy, in which you can choose your own name, in which you will never be asked to be less than yourself. I will make you and your family established and safe. I can make you a partner in everything I own." There was the ledger open again. It was a question of power dressed as a question of legacy. Spice felt the weight of it like the heat of a sun she had not invited. There was an innocence in the way she had laughed at his jokes earlier, a loyalty that had not yet been tested. "Sir," she said slowly, "you are a great man. You have built more than I can imagine. But you must understand what you ask. You are torn between wanting an heir and wanting to be loved. Those are not the same things. I am 22. I have my own dreams. I can't be sold." Alfred smiled, a tired thing and suddenly full of the old, private amusement he had once reserved for deals. "Then tell me what you would need to hear to not feel sold," he said. "Tell me what would make you choose this for yourself and not because somebody asked you to." And there, as the light on the balcony shifted, Spice felt the long, slow pivot of her life begin. She could see, with a clarity that frightened and thrilled her, the path that branched into possibilities: to take the offer and be used, to refuse and keep the small dignity of a life of scarce things, or to answer by shaping a deal on her own terms. She inhaled as if collecting courage into a speech. Outside, the city marched on. Inside, an empire hummed around the fragile decision of a young woman and a dying man who wanted, above all, to know that something of him would go on. Over the past weeks, Spice has developed a strange feelings towards the billionaire while they were always together laughing and telling stories at the balcony. Although the feelings were not clear, neither did she understand what they meant. The billionaire tried getting closer to her but she screamed no, and suddenly ran out of the room. Over the night while she was on her bed, she found herself rolling side to side, restless and confused, her mind in turmoil and pandemonium. Why me? I'm too young for this. What will my parents say? And what will people say? She thought of her poor parents, her mother a poor maid and her father a poor security man. She thought of her two younger brothers who were high school dropouts because their parents couldn't afford their school fees. She also thought of how life had been unfair to her family, and she said to herself, this could be an opportunity knocking at my door and a sacrifice that can rewrite my story and that of my family. 5 weeks passed. While she was doing her routine chores, she suddenly felt the urge to vomit and suddenly rushed to the bathroom. At first she couldn't understand how she was feeling, and that evening she took time to visit the billionaire in his room to express her new feeling. Could this be pregnancy? The billionaire asked. I don't know, she replied. Okay, don't worry, tomorrow I will tell the driver to take you to the doctor. At about 4 p.m. the next day, the billionaire got a call from his doctor. Hello, sir. I have ran a series of tests for your maid and I think she's pregnant. Okay, thank you so much, but you must keep this as a secret, the billionaire asked. Few days later, Chloe, sitting in the living room while glancing through her phone, surprisingly saw Spice anxiously rushing to the bathroom, and out of inquisitude she ran after her and discovered she was vomiting and retching. Chloe suddenly disappeared from the scene and ran to her mother. Hello, mother, I think your maid is pregnant. What do you mean by that? Angelo asked. This cannot be possible in my house, and then who must be responsible, and I hope it's not my husband? Few minutes later, Angelo went blazing, screaming Spice's name down her throat. She went to Spice's room and dragged her out to the sitting room. Surrounded by the 3 children, they questioned her like a young girl on a judgment seat. Are you pregnant? And who is responsible? They pushed her around until she fell to the floor in tears. Suddenly the billionaire Alfred rolled in on his wheelchair. What is happening here? And Angelo replied, your maid is pregnant, and Alfred replied back, I know. What do you mean by that? You mean you're aware she's pregnant? Yes, I am aware, and I have sent her to a clinic to confirm the pregnancy, and I want you to know that I am the father of the baby. There was a loud scream and the family was thrown into chaos. The air was tensed and horror filled their faces. Listen everyone, it's my decision to get her pregnant and not her intention. It was my last dying wish, and if any of you have a problem with that, you can come and face me. If you do anything to her or the baby, you will have me to contend with, and I will make sure that I throw all of you out of my house and do to you what you will always regret for the rest of your lives. As the day passed, rumors traveled round the mansion, penthouse, and other maids kept away from her as they gossiped her and called her husband Snatcher secretly. Life became almost unbearable for her as no one would want to talk to her anymore. Some days as she walked through the corridors at night, sometimes she fears if one of the daughters would jump out with a knife and stab her to death. On one occasion they've poured water on the floor where she slipped and fell unaware of the culprit. She went to Alfred few days later. Please, I want to leave this house, I am afraid they might kill me one day, and Alfred replied, don't worry, I have a plan and I will take you away from this place soon. Meanwhile, Angelo had secretly planted a device in Alfred's bedroom to monitor the conversation between the 2 newfound loves. 2 days later she retrieved the device and played it, all to discover Alfred's plan to send Spice abroad where she will leave and deliver the baby. Angelo assembled the children together, broke the news, and they started plotting how to kidnap and eliminate Spice on her way to the airport, with the driver not knowing that the billionaire had a plan B. Before this day, Alfred had called his lawyer barrister Jason and instructed him to rewrite his will. He told him about Spice and his new plan to have a son, and this was after he discovered from the doctor that the fetus is a male child. He disclosed to him that the child will be born abroad, and when the child is born, he should remain there until he is 18 years of age. Moreover, in his will, he instructed that after his death 70% of his total assets and 80% of the company shares should be managed by a firm until the child is 22 years, when it will be transferred to him. 20% of the total assets and 20% of the company shares should be given to Spice. 5% of the assets should be given to charity and the other 5% to Angelo and the 3 daughters. On the day before Spice travel, Alfred had called the family together and organized a little farewell party for Spice and announced the day of departure, not knowing that the family has an evil plan. After the party, the ladies assembled again. They organized and paid a group of kidnappers and assassin to lay an ambush on Spice's way to the airport to kidnap and eliminate her. By 12 a.m. that night, Alfred picked his phone and called Spice to his room. He instructed her to pick up few things in a small bag and start living. He instructed her to go through the back gate of the mansion, and behind the gate the driver will be there waiting for her to take her to the airport. She started moving. She could hear only her steps and her breath in the cold night. She thought to herself, this is an adventure, and silently prayed that the adventure would end with positive results, an outcome she would never regret. She safely arrived at the gate, and behind the gate was a car and one of Alfred's most loyal driver who has served him for over 20 years. He drove her straight to the airport that night, and in the next morning Angelo and the 3 daughters woke up to find that Spice was nowhere to be found. Once Spice landed and then arrived in a city where no one in Alfred's family had reached, the next danger was the logistics of a 9-month pregnancy in exile. Alfred had been relentless. Lawyers, passports, medical care, day nurses, and a small, guarded house for Spice and her mother to stay in until the child was born. He had arranged for a private midwife team and a hospital wing used only for his family's emergencies. When the boy came, a deep-voiced cry that pierced a bright, antiseptic morning, and then the exhausted, unsteady laughter of a young mother, the stories came home to the penthouse like a cold wind. A hospital fax, an encrypted call, a photograph handled as if it were contraband, the baby's tiny fist wrapped around a gloved finger. For a brief, private moment, Alfred sat in his chair and watched the images on his phone with a kind of reverence he had rarely granted the world. He saw the son he had wanted, a small human, furious with life and already red with need. The doctor reported the health of mother and child, spoke of weight and breathing and the unvarnished miracle of a child who had arrived wholly and well. A frenzy erupted in the penthouse the moment the news could no longer be contained. Angelo's face, already a mask of cultivated alarm and reproach, split into something closer to panic and then into calculus. Emma's vanity turned to sharpness, Chloe's conspiratorial bravado turned brittle, Eva's anger found new theater. But Alfred had not only brought a son into the world, he had finalized the structure that would protect him. The will, revised and notarized, was not a whim. It was a legal fortress. Barrister Jason had written entire paragraphs in plain language and in lawyer-sculpted clauses about trustees, terms, offshore holdings, and binding conditions. The child would be protected, the majority of the empire placed in a trustee firm, and Spice would be provided for with a stake that could not be cut away by a later angry hand. Angelo could not, by her own devices, surmount those protections. She scrambled to find leaks, cameras, moles, accountants. She found none that mattered. She tried to fire people and buy loyalties. Some left with their dignity intact, others took the money and departed. She screamed the way a queen without a crown might scream and tried to bend the narrative of the household by spreading rumors, lies thin enough that they would be believed by those starved for a story. Inside the mansion, the campaign of quiet cruelties continued for Spice's memory. Maids whispered and turned their faces away at the mention of her name. The world of work, for many who lived by rules of etiquette and fear, is quick to discipline anyone who upends the balance of a household. That cruelty, spite in cheap costumes, might have been enough to break a lesser spirit. But Spice had, by the time of the birth, the confidence of a woman who had been shielded by the extraordinary. A billionaire, stubborn and desperate, risked his reputation and his last months to secure a future for her child. When Alfred's lawyer served Angelo and the daughters with an updated copy of the will, they read the numbers like verdicts. 70% of the assets and 80% of company control would stay under corporate trusteeship, not for the girls' lifetimes but until the child reached the age specified. 20% of the assets and 20% of the company were placed in Spice's name, 5% donated to charity, 5% set aside for Angelo and the daughters, a measure, Alfred insisted in his letters, of both justice and mercy. He had written, "You have had enough. Let this remedy an imbalance. If you accept it, the world will look upon us differently. If you do not, you will be the authors of your ruin." The daughters reacted with that mixture of rage and short-sightedness that men have long seen from their heirs when deprived. They threatened legal suits and public scandals. They lit the kind of fires that sometimes attract more attention than they dampen. They hired counsel who made noises and recommended the kind of lawsuits that drag in tabloids and rumors. But Barrister Jason had thought of possible legal assaults before they could be thought. His documents were layered like locks. Public opinion could be stoked, but the law, precise and indifferent, favored the letter that Alfred had signed in sound mind. So it became a war of small cruelties versus engineered protection. Angelo tried to sabotage Alfred's health. Whispers to the nurses, doctored schedules, angry confrontations that left his chest tight and his sleep interrupted. But Alfred's remaining months followed a different rhythm. He had tried to make amends, apologies to those who appeared upset with him, rendering the daily clean rituals of a man deciding how to step away without remorse. He visited Spice in the hospital once, the day after the birth, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to be small and clumsy. He held his son, the boy that would one day inherit both the weight of a name and the compassion of being wanted, and he felt, frankly and without pretense, like a man who could finally close his own ledger. Spice, for all the vicissitudes she had been forced through, proved a kind of iron, warm and unbreakable. She named the baby according to a request Alfred made, a name that would quietly tie him to the Moreau line but not bind him to the household's cruelties. She took no pleasure in the humiliation of his family. She took satisfaction from the safety arranged for her child and the knowledge that the boy would be raised in a place where his existence was not a scandal but an obligation of goodwill. As Alfred's health declined, the mansion's factions found themselves smaller than they had been. Rumors that would have once toppled men now shivered against the walls of sealed trusts and notarized documents. Angelo attempted a final gambit, a late-night attempt to pressure Alfred into reconsideration, a scene staged with the kind of melodrama the daughters loved to perform. Alfred listened to their accusations like a man who had been listening to the same song on repeat for so long that he could hum the melody without hating it. He made no promise to change. Instead he made a final kind of parent's demand, that their names be untangled from his headline and that they be allowed their 5% and whatever dignity they could reconstruct with it. "Leave me in peace," he said to them once, voice thin but precise, "and leave this child in peace." It happened the way dignified things sometimes do, with small rituals and quiet hands. Alfred's final weeks were filled with apples cut into neat slices by a dutiful chef, with music he loved played low on evenings, with the boy's photograph propped near his bed. He grew thinner, then thinner still. He spoke to Mark on the phone, to Jessica on a short video call that had been arranged by his lawyers, and to Spice more than once in the hospital corridor where nurses had learned to look away and respect the intimacy between two adults who had made a difficult choice. On a clear morning after a winter storm that had washed the city bright, Alfred's breathing stilled. The doctor came and said the words that had been given in half-measured sentences months before. He had seen the son alive and he had signed the last papers. He had watched the empire, in the final act, be placed into a structure that could not be collapsed by sudden family greed. The funeral was small and private. Angelo and the daughters attended, their dresses impeccable, their faces carved by the same practiced poise that had allowed them to practice cruelties in quieter rooms. Journalists wrote the thin, eager pieces they always write when money changes hands. Family lawyers prepared for a life in which they would spend money arguing. For a time there were lawsuits and press briefings, but the quick violence of outrage faded. Barrister Jason's paperwork had been careful enough to disincentivize such battles. The trustees took control. The boy remained abroad for the time Alfred had required. For Spice, the period after Alfred's death was a study in obligations and small triumphs. She learned to navigate a new legal identity, to trust the people Barrister Jason assigned to her care, to breastfeed a child who, in his first year, grew round and loud and enamored of the world. She also learned to hold resentment, of the daughters who had been cruel to her, of Angelo who had plotted in secret, and of a society that found it easy to pity and hard to protect. Time softens edges as it always does. Angelo and her daughters found new houses and new routines. They spent money that made them comfort but not happiness. Publicly they flourished like flowers in a greenhouse, bright, deceptive, sustained by the same mechanics they had used to attempt to take Spice down. But within the richer, private places, in the small rooms when the lights were turned low, there was a new knowledge that their actions had been recorded, understood, and resisted. There is a peculiar humility that comes from losing an argument with the law. Years later the boy, raised abroad by careful tutors and under the watchful eyes of trustees, would come to the penthouse for the first time. He would be a child who carried the Moreau name and the strange kindness of a grandfather he had not known for long. People would remark on the oddness of the arrangement, the stories that had once filled the pages of gossip now passed down to grandchildren. They would talk not of scandal but of how a man had tried to fashion a legacy, public and private, and failed or succeeded in ways that only time can measure. And in the quiet end, when the city had long made new headlines and old empires had been folded into new formats, a small photograph remained on a table in the house where Alfred had once sat, Spice holding a baby, Walter standing nearby with a proud squint, the simple proof that a calculation made in the last months of life had not merely been a transaction but a gamble for human continuity. Alfred had wanted, in the end, one thing more than anything else, to be certain that something of his hand would last beyond his breath. He had engineered that certainty with all the ruthless ingenuity that had made him rich. In doing so he had altered the fates of people who had acted like vultures and people who had acted like saints. The judgment of history is slow and often ambiguous. In this small story the ledger closed on a complicated balance. Pain and protection, cruelty and provision, a child born into safety and a family that had to reckon with the cost of their hunger. Spice, watching the boy sleep in the quiet hours of the night, felt sometimes the weight of her choices and sometimes the small, profound peace of a mother who had been chosen to protect a life. She understood that nothing could erase all the scars. She understood also that one life saved and loved could rewrite the story of 100 hungry nights. She smiled then, not because the world had become kind, but because she had, at last, something of her own to hold. If you like this story, kindly like, share and subscribe to this channel for more beautiful stories.